There's two types of testing, the PCR test. So that's for people who are symptomatic. So we've, again, as the cases have risen, we've made that more available to our population through the local testing sites that we have. Secondly, we've made sure that we have lateral flow tests for asymptomatic people to take up, and that's both through our pharmacy offer, the collect offer, so people can take that home, but also through the supervised offer. So we're doing that, and that's really important as we saw the Prime Minister announce last night for things that are opening up, encouraging people to test as required. So we continue to do a lot of work and also continue to manage outbreaks and situations as you would expect as they rise, as we see some of the virus spread in certain settings, but managing that well. Chief Executive Leader, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Simon. So just moving through the rest of the report in corporate terms, one point I would like to highlight verbally to Cabinet is the issue to do with the Grayson Suite, the temporary mortuary facilities that we established for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight under the LRF arrangements, and they're explained again at paragraphs 19 to 21. The two reasons for highlighting those here today are firstly to confirm that we've now wound down the Grayson Suite, which is the title that was given for the temporary mortuary facilities in Basingstoke, to acknowledge again the support of the community that we had for that temporary arrangements, because there was some unsettlement about that happening. To acknowledge also, though, that for the wider area for the future, we're conscious that across the partnership of the LRF, there will be continuing demand around additional mortuary capacity for the area outside of emergency planning. But we need to acknowledge the point that I've put into the report, that the location that we chose for the Grayson Suite, while appropriate at that time, would not be appropriate for future permanent provision going forward. Taking you further forward then to paragraph 43 and onwards, this is to confirm for you that given the state of the crisis, which is now in a different phase altogether, we have wound down the emergency planning and crisis management arrangements within the organisation. We've had a gold, silver and bronze command system for managing services and responses for over a year now. Those are mechanisms that are usually designed to last 3 or 4 days in crises. So an extraordinary set of activities, but we are now reverted into the ordinary line management arrangements. CMT has continued to function, but it is now overseeing all of that work, and that's a very positive development which we are really pleased to confirm to Cabinet today. The one dimension that sits alongside CMT, it is still an evolution outside of crisis management arrangements. I'll come to it in just a moment in this report, is that we're moving the recovery work into economic recovery specifically. So a parallel officer arrangement to work alongside the subcommittee of this Cabinet considering the economy of the County Council in recovery terms, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Paragraph 46 onwards considers as adults' health and care, and obviously without wishing to understate the work that's been done across the County Council, the work of adults' health and care has been essential and exceptional throughout the course of the pandemic. Continues to be an outstanding response to the needs of older people particularly, but also vulnerable adults who have been particularly affected by the crisis. The report talks to the continuing strong relationships between the NHS and ourselves and the independent sector, and that work will continue beyond the crisis, I am confident. Section 51 onwards talks about the pressures within children's social care. Adults' social care are feeling the same exceptional pressure of a post-pandemic bow wave of need in the community affecting vulnerable adults and vulnerable children. And in children's services, we're talking about a consistent uplift of around about 20% of referrals, serious referrals to the organisation. That gives you an indication of the pressure upon the services, which were already under significant pressure before COVID hit us. So that's worth bearing in mind. The report notes the government has moved on the issue to do with testing and bubbles within schools, and that's, we consider, a very, very positive development to get the schools community ready for the September term and make sure the disruption of COVID is lessened considerably by the time we get to the September term. And that has to be a very, very positive step. Hearing again on the news today how low the representation is of children in the pandemic, which is very good news, obviously. 52 of the report talks also, though, that the work of our support to children and schools will continue through the summer around summer school activity and the food support systems that have come to be so depended upon by some families in the community. Moving on briefly, Chairman, if I may, section 54, paragraph 54 of the report onwards talks about the economic recovery in Hampshire. I personally think that this is an extremely well-crafted section, not written by me, I should stress, an important analysis of the economic implications for the County Council, which I think is very important today to understand the context of the move to recovery nationally and locally. The report talks about a £6 to £7 billion loss to the economy of the wider community, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Talks about the implications particularly, but not only for the hospitality sector, talks about the support that we've had from government, how that's been utilised across the community, but then particularly from section 60 onwards, and I would stress this for members if I may, outlines a future programme of the Council's role in trying to drive economic recovery and providing leadership to the business community and the LEP community for the future, including taking support from the new Economics Foundation to support that work, closely involved in reaching stage 4. And I think that's a critical section, if I may say so. Finally, members, on two further points within the report, routinely, we have a section on what we call collective wisdom, which is the operational project to support our return to more normal working, but also recognising that we'll never return to what we were before. This covers our return to office accommodation for those office accommodation staff who have been out of the office for so long, and how we're staging that for the future, but also covers issues to do with the future operating model and how we will all be working differently with new technology going forward, and take some of the benefit from this dreadful time. And finally, section 71 of the report goes back into the community engagement work, which has been another strong feature of our approach to the pandemic, and I applaud the staff who've been involved in that. Really high quality communication with partners and the public about what's happening, and I think it's important to stress that there. The recommendations are back at paragraph 2, 1 to 5, and require largely to be noted, members, if that's okay. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you very much, Leader.
John, thank you very much. I think I just add a couple of points to that. First of all, really dwelling on what Simon said, it appears that in this county we've now got just under 80% of the over 40s that have been vaccinated and 90% of the over 50s, which is really very encouraging. I'm also conscious of the fact that the 5-year death rate, normal death rate, is above the rate at the moment, which again demonstrates the fact that the vaccinations are having an effect on what had been a really bad situation earlier on in the year and last year as well in terms of the number of deaths. I note what the Chief Executive said about loss to the economy, and I think that's the next point to make. Our efforts must now be focused on the recovery and how we can all work together, both districts, boroughs, ourselves, and of course the private sector, to ensure that the economy recovers as quickly as possible. I also get the impression that one of the constraints will now be the lack of staff for the various different, particularly the hospitality sector, in terms of actually taking a full account of the number of people that want to now holiday, go out to eat and everything else. And I think that is going to be a problem, a shortage of key staff. And your final point, I totally agree with. The new normal, effectively what this pandemic has done is change the way we operate and brought forward by 4 or 5 years the use of technology. And we just got to ensure that we get the balance right between meeting as we're doing today in person, but also where it's efficient to do so, carrying out a significant amount of our work online. But I think I've said enough. I leave it open to my fellow cabinet members to respond to any comments in the report. Steve.
Thank you, Leader. I've got 3 points which I've noted down as a result of the presentations we've just received. I think Hampshire County Council has a role to play in helping everyone in Hampshire define what the new normal will be. It looks as if the vaccines have successfully broken the link between infection and hospitalisation. And I think it's on that breaking of the link that the government's new policy announcements have been made. But we have got to factor that in. It looks as if the press continues to talk a lot about cases rather than hospitalisations, and I'm sure that cases are on the rise and will continue to rise for some time, and that the relaxation of disciplines is likely to accelerate that in the short term. So I don't know if the officers want to comment on that, but the new normal, I think, is something that we can help to define. The Director of Public Health mentioned a peak of cases in late August, and that immediately raised a jangling bell in my head about coming just before the schools go back. So is there anything that we should be doing to mitigate that? And I look towards Simon perhaps to comment on that. And then the third question I had really was, we're going to get a lot of contacts, I think, from constituents saying that they are worried about event X, or somebody should be doing something about that. And it would be useful to define to our members what powers we have that we could deploy in the event that we get a Hampshire-specific issue that is worrying our constituents. And again, perhaps Simon can talk about our powers under previous acts on that, and it might be worth some communication with members about what we can do if there is a specific problem. Those were my points, Leader.
Thank you, Stephen. Simon, would you like to comment on the two items that Councillor Reid mentioned?
Thank you, Councillor Reid. So, first one, you're absolutely right. We need to be prepared for what may happen later in the summer, and with schools, and myself and the Assistant Director of Education are connecting with schools today to see what mitigations we can put in place that don't impact on education, but may actually enable the school to run, because we need to do that. What I'm understanding is that schools will not be asked, pupils may not be asked to isolate in September, so that will actually reduce the bubbles needing to isolate. But, you know, let's think about other measures we're doing, and we're doing that carefully. And we've written to all schools, because whilst bubbles can end on the 19th, we're saying carry that on for the last week, because that would help you manage that. So a lot of work going in schools to make sure they're safe, and they are doing very well. With regards to events, you're right, we do have powers. If there is an imminent risk due to COVID, we can then put a direction in and suggest that event, well, ask that event not to go ahead. So we are very mindful of that. There's a very serious power we have, but we take it very, very carefully, and would only use that in extremis should that be required. And that's got to be a risk to the population. So we are working through that. We work very carefully with our district colleagues who oversee the safety advisory groups and ensure that COVID measures are put in place as suggested around vaccinations or testing or social distancing, so that actually the events are as safe as possible, so that we don't have to use our powers if we were concerned. So we do all of that.
Thank you, Simon. Any other comments from my colleagues?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Rob.
Thank you very much. It was just to pick up on the point the Chief Executive made about the economic impact and recovery and the work that we're doing there. And you mentioned this, indeed, Chairman, in terms of our partnership working and how vitally important that's going to be, working with all our colleagues, not just with our local authority colleagues, but as you said, sort of a private sector as well, and how we're going to sort of integrate that in terms of, we launched last week, we were part of the Hampshire Story, and how we involve that through the Hampshire 50 Commission. All these things now need to come together in how we look at that recovery. But I just wanted to stress the importance of it, because it affects all departments right across the local authority, and indeed all the residents, and the importance of that partnership working. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Rob. Very good point. No other comments? Yes, Steve.
Thank you, Leader. What's been done, I think, is absolutely exemplary on how to do it properly. I note on page 41, paragraph 71, which is talking about the communications and community engagement. I'd just like to ask a quick question on that. Obviously, the demographics that we're targeting for additional vaccinations tend to be younger people now. and potentially at a later phase when government approves it, the under 18s, but currently it's the 18 to 25. In terms of the communications, are we altering our strategy to make sure that we're making our communications relevant to that younger demographic?
Simon, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. We've changed the way we communicate, the language we communicate, and the method of delivering the vaccination programme. Over the weekend and this week, we've got Grab a Jab, so people who are younger can just pitch up, and that's been very successful. We had Danny Ings, a footballer from Saints, promoting that as well. And I guess if you haven't seen that, that's probably because you're not quite in the right demographic to view that using things like TikTok, Snapchat, and those other things that our younger population do. But also really encouraging organisations such as businesses, if they've got younger people working for them, to really support that and enable them to go and get a jab. So yeah, lots going on in that space, using the language that they might relate to rather than language that we might relate to.
Thank you very much. Let us move on to item 7, end of year financial report. And this is going to be the last report given by Caroline Williamson in her present capacity as Director of Corporate Resources. Caroline.
Thank you, Leader. I'll take you through what is a comprehensive report, but what I intended to do was just to pull out the more salient points for you. So if we look at the top of page 51, COVID financial consequences for last year. What we can see is that the total costs and losses were in the order of £160 million. You then have a table that presents the funding sources that we used to offset those one-off costs, and that comes to some £168 million. That therefore means that we had £8 million remaining, which has been carried forward to the current financial year. But what I need to say is that that carry forward funding is absolutely necessary, particularly when you look at the future projections around potential multi-year costs still resulting directly from COVID. And what you can see on page 52 is a projected 3-year figure to 2023-24 of some 72 million. And I tend to use that phrase, this is less worse than the figures we were looking at in previous months, but it is still very clearly funding that the County Council had not budgeted for, had not planned for, and had not intended to fund. And whilst we do have a recovery package, it's born of reprioritisation of funding that you would otherwise have had choices around how to use that funding. So if we turn away then from the direct impact of COVID onto the 2021 last year outturn for all departments, very positive news. The departments all managed to contain their expenditure within their budgets, and they also managed to deliver a vast proportion of what were planned savings that were being delivered early, which contribute to the departmental costs of change, which are necessary to then support the investment in delivering future change programmes. So very positive news in terms of the performance of all of our departments. And then on page 53, we talk about the other budgets. Now, as you'll see, £30 million of that available funding was already allocated by you at a previous meeting to support the medium-term costs of COVID. So the 72 million I talked about, 30 million of the funding is already redirected from that source. That then left us £14.7 million for you to make some prioritised decisions around. And what's presented within the report is a small number of items that are very important to invest in. The first one is £3 million additional funding for the current year into highways maintenance. And the report also refers to the strong intention to allocate in the medium-term financial strategy from 22-23 a further £7 million, split between highways maintenance and the consolidation of Operation Resilience. And that £7 million accounts for some 1% increase in council tax, just in context. The report also recommends £6 million to invest in what we're calling the new ways of working. So as you'll recall, all of our office-based staff have been working from home for some 15, 16 months. And that required us to remove from the offices screens, chairs, etc. And therefore, the return to the office, even through a hybrid working arrangement, requires us to reinvest in that technology kit and other equipment. What we also need to do is to look at the investment for formal meetings being held in a hybrid mechanism. You can see at the moment we've got very interim arrangements in place to allow us to comply with the legislation around streaming meetings, etc. And we need to look at better ways of supporting the hybrid ways of working, as the leader referred to earlier. Now, the £6 million that we're using there primarily came from the fact that we weren't travelling and we weren't printing, and therefore we've made some efficiencies in the year which have allowed us that diversion of resource. Also, a recommendation around 4.3 million for property rationalisation. Inevitably, our new ways of working will result in some movement between buildings, which usually costs a small amount of money, but more importantly, it might allow us to come out of some leased and owned buildings, and we do have to account for things like dilapidation, etc. when we do so, but in so doing we could save some recurring revenue, and also, if we own the buildings, release some capital investment. 1.3 million into our high yield investment reserve, and that's really just to mitigate against any losses in value in those high yielding investments. We don't intend that that should be utilised because we're holding those investments for the medium term, and we wouldn't be looking to sell any of those investments at a point that there was a downturn. But legally we're required to make a reserve for that eventuality. And then just two final, smaller but very important items, £100,000 being allocated to the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations across Hampshire, and also £110,000 for health and safety recurring investment as we look at the resources that we have to support strong health and safety responses across our organisation. And that will also be factored into the budget setting. Leader, that was everything I wanted to draw attention to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Comments from my Cabinet colleagues? Russell.
Well, just to say that the additional funding going into highways is very welcome. We do have a huge challenge across the network to keep the roads in the current state that they're in. We have better roads than our neighbouring counties. We want to keep it that way. What I would say, though, is we may not be as lucky in the forthcoming winter as we were last winter, where we had a warmer winter and that led to the slight underspend. You know, with climate change, it's impossible to predict what the weather's going to do, and we've seen that over the last few days with the extraordinary torrential rain we've had. If we have a cold winter, it is going to put pressure, and we're going to need that extra funding, but we are very grateful for it in the Highways Department. That was a comment. May I ask a question, since I've got the floor? Carolyn mentioned the new ways of working and the investment in hybrid, and following on from the Chief Executive's comment on the rather superbly titled Collective Wisdom Project, when do you think that we might have a clearer sense of the savings that might arise from the new ways of working, the release of the buildings that you have? I'm not saying that to put any pressure on that process. It'll take as long as it takes. But would we be reasonable in thinking that this time next year you'll have a clearer sense of what the financial implications might be of these new hybrid ways of working?
Carolyn.
I would say it probably would be around about this time next year. What we've all been doing as part of the collective wisdom exercise is working really carefully with our teams of staff to make sure that we are engaging and implementing new ways of working that we all understand and are confident will support the exceptional performance that you all expect from the County Council and our residents expect from the County Council. What we've also said is we've had just over a year of homeworking and relying upon technology to an extent that we've never had before. Prior to that, we had many generations of old ways of working, and what we're trying to do is to blend the good from our previous ways of working with the good from the current ways of working. But it's an absolute leap of faith, because what we put in place to start with, we'll have to keep a continual review on in order to make sure that we change those ways of working as we need to maintain that high performance. And the reason for a year, I think that's probably long enough to be able to measure, assess, and continually adjust. And at that point, hopefully, we'll be able to then determine that we can actually make savings, both from a revenue and also hopefully a capital release perspective. The last thing we would want to do is to jump into trying to release some of those savings to then find that our ways of working have been detrimental to our strong performance. Thank you.
Any other comments at all? I would just like to add that what I've been particularly impressed with is the fact that we've been very cautious in our estimates over the last year, and rightly so, but they've been pretty consistent, having spent a fair amount of time with my fellow leaders across the country of counties, county leaders across the country. It's very clear to me that many of their projections have varied significantly going up or down during the last year or two, whereas ours have remained pretty consistent with a slightly better picture at the end than when we started out, which I would argue is the right way round. And I'd also fully endorse the comments made by the Director of Corporate Resources when it comes to trying to ensure that we get the balance right between taking the best out of what we've already done in the past, but introducing new ways of working where it's appropriate as a result of our experience over the last year. So with those remarks, you're all happy with the recommendations which are at paragraph 3 to 11 for the Cabinet, and then one at the end which is little bracket A for a recommendation to the County Council itself. I think I've got that right, haven't I? Okay, everybody in agreement? Thank you very much. Moving on to item 8, which is the climate change initiatives. Felicity Rowe, I think you're speaking on this one.
Sorry, let me just get the right file open. Doesn't want to. There we go. So this is a fairly brief paper with a proposal to spend £1.2 million of the funding already agreed by Cabinet in February as a result of various changes we made to other funding streams. And the 1.2 million proposal is set out for you at the base of the report in terms of some of the detail of breakdown of what we propose to spend it on. But overall, this is a programme over the next 2 years to put some pilot schemes in place and some test schemes in place to take forward some of the climate change opportunities around our corporate estate. So the proposals cover everything from the built estate, and we've got that includes schools and also the county council's own buildings. They cover the transport fleet, catering, some of our procurement, and into countryside. And there are a range of programmes that will give legs up here and there to different initiatives. They vary from increasing the ways we can use our electric vehicle fleet. We're moving all our, where possible, we're moving all our vehicles now to electric vehicles, and we'll look for enhancements as well in the way we use biofuels in those that we can't make electric. There will be work around how we move all our current power tools into electric power tools, and that will bring some real benefits around health and safety as well, because they don't vibrate in the way that others do. We'll be looking at some rewilding, a significant event at Hilliers to set up a new propagation unit that will begin to bring on the type of trees, etc., that we want to put out into the countryside, but also to support the work that they're going to be doing on future planting and future cropping that we could be expecting over the next 50 years to have to bring into Hampshire. We're looking at going into some carbon negative positions around our country parks, and a fairly major educational input into our Runways End outdoor activity centre, which will become a carbon neutral venue, and will, I think, be highly educational in terms of many of the activities or many of the initiatives they're putting in there to make that centre truly self-sustaining. We're also looking at a major expansion of the LED lighting across the corporate estate, which is one of the most simple ways to effectively bring down electricity use. And all our electricity is now carbon neutral in terms of our offset, so that is a huge benefit as well. We're also looking at a programme for energy efficiency for community buildings across Hampshire, where we are proposing that we set up a scheme whereby they can apply for some basic changes to community buildings, such as LED lighting, that will mean that we can put in a contract that will achieve those changes for them, and therefore bring the basic level of energy efficiency across the community estate up to a sort of more acceptable level. Some community buildings will have it in place already. That's brilliant, but they don't get any more. But we hope that we'll be able to bring everything up to a basic level, and I hope that will be very well received across the town and parish councils. And the other thing, just to emphasise across this money, is that we want to make it as educational as possible. So a huge number of the venues where the funding will be going in are publicly accessible venues, and we're working very hard with Chitra and the wider Hampshire-wide carbon reduction programme to make sure that every venue we have across the corporate estate that can have a public-facing educational element, can carry educational materials, do educational events and activities that will help to get the message of what the individual and the small corporation can do to make the differences that we're all going to need to make in order to take us through to neutrality for 2050. So that's all I want to say by way of introduction.
Thank you very much, Felicity. I'd just like to make a couple of comments. I think it's very important to note that we started off 2 years ago, having declared the climate emergency, of analysing the problem we've got to solve our own issues about CO2 and other emissions. We've then actually worked out, having worked out what the problem is, come up with a number of solutions, and using organisations like the Carbon Trust to ensure that we've got the problem sorted out in the first place. And then finally, we're now changing things on the ground, and we're taking action. And I think it's very important to stress that last point. There's a lot of people that talk about climate neutrality, climate change, and all the possibilities that one could do to achieve it. We're actually getting on with it on the ground. And that's what's important about the list at page 107, 108. A great range of activities, and obviously there'll be more of those in the future. Edward.
Chairman, thank you. And I would just like to add a couple of comments. The first one is, and I'm sure there's this natural one, we look at what we've got to do in our adaptation to climate change, and we look at the figure and we go 1.2 million, really? Well, the answer is from small acorns, mighty oaks grow, and that's particularly true, I think, in our project at Hilliers with the propagation unit, We know we're going to have to grow many trees. We know many of the issues that we're dealing with, such as ash dieback, are related to how we've met these challenges in the past. This is where we start, and it's a practical step that needs to be taken and taken early in order for us to deliver those objectives in the future. And I think a key example of that is further on in the report, where we look at the £30 million that we've got to work across our estate, particularly our schools. The only reason we got that money is because we invested early in having off-the-shelf, ready, tested plans for delivery. And while we have in here a range of projects, some of those actually they seem a bit, really proof of concept on food waste at the Royal Victoria Country Park. Well, actually, it's great to talk about these things in the commercial setting, but actually delivering them, understanding the mechanics, and from that small project, how that rolls out, understanding how that would work through our school catering scheme. These are very important steps in a journey to making real and dramatic changes. There are, Chairman, also some projects in here that are of themselves, really excellent pieces of work. And I mean, £200,000 for tree planting across our state, an excellent step in itself. Chairman, I actually find this a really exciting report. I think that it is both in itself delivery, it's also setting us up for future delivery. And the final one, which I think is equally as important that Felicity touched on, is it's about education and showcasing to other partners, whether they are public or private sector, that actually there are things that you can do on the ground with great practicalities. And Chairman, I think it's a fantastic report. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Rob.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I had a few questions, but I think Felicity answered most of those in her presentation. But there was a couple of points in terms of, I think, the importance of the cross-department working that has gone on. It's been excellent and really, really good. But I was at a meeting a few weeks ago with the South East strategic leaders, and there was talk there about what different authorities are doing and the work with the Carbon Trust, and they did a presentation there. And the Carbon Trust actually mentioned and singled out Hampshire for the excellent work that has been going on, been working with them. In fact, as you have mentioned previously, Leader, that we are literally leading the way with them with that work. So that is excellent news from that point of view. Just one, we were talking about, you talked much about the education side, and Councillor Heron did as well. Do we actually do any direct involvement with the schools themselves? I know we're doing, through the library services and everything else, but actually engaging directly with the schools was the question.
Yeah, there's actually a strand within the work that Chitra is leading, where funding has been given into children's services to one of the lead inspectors, and they have prepared packs on climate change that are being used across the curriculum within schools. But we will also be working into that so that when schools come on visits to outdoor centres, etc., that will be there will be a continuity there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Councillor Chabb wants to speak, Leader.
Ros.
Thank you, Leader. Just to, I do think this is a wonderful report, and it is very, very exciting. In regards to our young people in our schools, I'm really pleased to see some of the work that's already going on to do with climate change. We've had some wonderful pieces of artwork down at the cathedral over the last few weeks that our young people have developed during the last 12 months actually, and I'm sure I think it's going to Hilliers very soon, and I would encourage everyone to go and see it. In regards to this, one thing that I am really conscious of is we need to continually to engage with our young people in regards to climate change and make sure that they are around the table with us in decisions that we make. It's a very, very important topic, not only for us, but for them too. And it's one of the reasons why we are doing what we are doing, is so that they do have a great future ahead of them in Hampshire.
Thank you, Ros. I think I just add to that young people are the advocates, the best advocates to persuade the rest of the community, as it's their lives that are going to be affected most if we don't get it right. So you're absolutely right. It's important to engage with the schools and with the pupils at schools. Any other comments at all? Steve, and then Steve 2. Steve 1, Steve 2.
It's a contextual one, really. I wouldn't want anybody to read this paper and think that it is all that Hampshire County Council is doing. It is another tranche of things that we're doing. I'm conscious of the fact that our property services people have done extremely well in attracting over £2 million worth of government grants for environmental work in schools. So in Kempshott Infant and Juniors, the double glazing, which is more thermally efficient, is currently being installed. But we've got a wave of photovoltaic cells to be installed on school buildings to help control the use of energy. So there's an awful lot going on. I hope that that work will continue. And I've got no hesitation at all in supporting this.
Thank you, Steve. Steve Foster.
Thank you, Leader. Councillor Reid, Stephen stole my script, I think. But if I can add to his comments, which I fully agree with, we are leading by example, not just talking hot air. We're actually delivering the goods on this. And I think in terms of leading by example, one of the things that's really important is about not just doing things like recycling more, but it's about reducing use in the first place. And I know that's something the Council has been working on very extensively. I'm delighted to see these pilot projects coming forward. And even more important, I think, will be the outcome of the pilots as we take them into firm full-time projects that we roll out to our facilities and to the public as appropriate and to businesses, because the whole point of a pilot is to prove a concept, show it's viable, show it's worthwhile, and then see the results. And I think this investment that we're making up front will, as Councillor Heron said earlier on, will lead to further opportunities and the ability to get grants from government where appropriate, and we'll see a lot more. So I commend this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I'd just like to emphasise what you said about reducing waste, because ultimately, the further upstream you can reduce it in the first place, the less need there is to collect it and then find other ways of disposing of it. So I think that's a really good point. I'd just like to make one other point, and that is that the government has a habit of providing funding and then saying it has to be spent very quickly. I think we're in a very good position now to continue to take advantage of those opportunities provided, because we've got a range of schemes that I'm certain we could expand if there was more money available, and equally following our success with the funding for schools, buildings amongst other things. I think this is something that we must always bear in mind when we're coming forward with projects. Just think about how they could be expanded if the funding was made available by the government, which I'm certainly will be in the future. Nothing else from my colleagues. Therefore, I'd be grateful if you could approve the recommendation at para 2 on page 105. All in favour? Thank you very much indeed. Let's move on to the item 9, Hampshire Broadband Programme. Before we do that, I'm now going to ask Councillor Porter to say a few words. Having got to... why don't you come over there, Jackie? Yeah. And Jackie, if you want to stay there after you've finished as you're doing the next item as well, that's probably easier.
Thank you, and it's good to be back. Thank you. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much for this paper. It's really encouraging to see it here for the benefit of the residents and the businesses in Hampshire. I particularly welcome the additional £1 million to the top-up fund for Hampshire's economic wellbeing and for the residents and for the businesses and for their actual well-being too, because so many of them have used them to connect to other people. I have to say the position is still not clear with regard to the tendered work that's going to be going on across the district or across the county. And perhaps Mr. Blogg may be able to elucidate that a little bit more. But my belief is that at the moment, this gigabit scheme, to which the residents and businesses have to commit to doubling their current speeds. It's not to take them up to a gigabit type speed, it is just to double their current speed. Most communities have taken this on themselves as community fibre partnerships, and they're acting in a very public-spirited way. And this is resulting in higher than expected quotes to include properties far away from the original plans. And this issue was rehearsed very well at the Policy and Resources Committee in February. The point I'm making is that community fibre partnerships are currently being encouraged by Openreach to add these real outliers to their plans, and they're resulting in a higher price for each of those contracts. And that means that Hampshire County Council's top-up is higher than it actually needs to be. And I know this has been a source of frustration to the team at Hampshire County Council as well. And so I really do welcome that £1 million, but urge the team to make sure that they're spending it wisely, in the sense of those community fibre partnerships aren't taking on too great a wider role, which means that the cost is too high. I do want to make sure that this gain share that hopefully Hampshire will win in the end, in July 2022, of £1.1 million, has resulted in a really high number of people in Hampshire who have actually been upgraded on the gigabit scheme, and that we aren't ending up paying more than we should have for those real outlier properties, which actually would have been covered under the tendered process anyway. I know that this is something that P&R will continue to look at, and I'm grateful for that. And I know that the team absolutely know the measure of the problem. But I just wanted to bring it forward at this point to say that it is a realism check as well, that we can't just keep putting money into this for Openreach to take advantage of, or any other provider. It's something that we definitely need to be very clear about what the range of those community fibre partnerships can cover.
Thank you, Jackie. You make a perfectly reasonable point, and you can be assured that we will be doing whatever we can to ensure that we are getting value for money for all the council taxpayer here in Hampshire, and not simply subsidising what Openreach should be doing in the first place. Now I'd like to hand over to Patrick Blogg, who's going to take us through this particular item.
Thank you, Leader. Good morning, members. Thank you for your comments, Councillor Porter, as well, which I'll address later as well. The principal purpose of the report in front of you is really just about setting out the proposal for a £1 million top-up to the new Building Digital UK voucher scheme. But also the report gives an update on the Superfast broadband programme, but gives a bit of an introduction into Project Gigabit, which you'll see covered in the report. The report is split into 5 main sections. The first is an update on the Superfast programme, as I mentioned. It gives a briefing on the current voucher scheme and also the new scheme that's in place, and it gives a proposal for a top-up of the new voucher scheme. The summary of Project Gigabit follows later in the report, and then I go on to talk about the financial considerations as part of it. So if I just draw your attentions to paragraphs 11 to 16 by way of an update on the Superfast programme. This started in 2013 and has delivered through 2 contracts which were negotiated nationally with a total of around £30 million of public money. So far, those contracts have delivered 115,000 premises of superfast speed, 12,000 of which is full fibre. We expect that to be complete in summer 2022, and we know we've still got some work to do in the New Forest to complete that, where there are some special circumstances, but good progress is being made. But that still leaves 27,000 premises which don't have superfast speeds at the moment. If I just go on to paragraphs 17 to 23, this really just gives you a flavour of the voucher scheme in place. So it talks about the previous gigabit voucher scheme, which was launched in 1920, which is a government-administered scheme. Now, the County Council previously provided £1 million top-up to that scheme, and that finished in March of this year. And what we found with that scheme, it was both popular and successful, but it did close early through government due to the demand on that scheme. We saw a huge increase in the number of applicants for that scheme in the run-up to the closure of that scheme. Now, in terms of what it delivered, we've delivered through that scheme 23 schemes as part of the Gigabit Voucher Scheme, and the top-up spend is pretty much complete, the original top-up spend there. But what that delivered is access to around 2,100 premises. Now, the new scheme that was put in place by government launched in April 2021, called the UK Gigabit Voucher Scheme, and it has broadly the same criteria that the previous scheme had. There was a slight nuance with the new scheme that you have to be part of what they call Ofcom Area 3 for that scheme, which is around the competition that exists within that space. And we know that a number of communities who were part of the previous scheme didn't make the cut-off when government closed the scheme down. And we're looking to see if those schemes can be rolled over to the new scheme as part of this pickup there. Can I draw your attention to the proposal in 24 to 28, paragraphs 24 to 28? So this proposal is for a further £1 million top-up to the new scheme, which will add £1,500 per residential property for those applicants. What it is a good and efficient way, an effective way to accelerate delivery in advance of the Project Gigabit programme, which I'm going to come on to in a minute. Now, the funding to UK, we provide that to Building Digital UK, and it's allocated on a first-come, first-served basis for those who apply to the scheme. And I think a really important point to make here is the accountability for that scheme is it's a government-administered scheme, and residents apply for vouchers to the government for this and work directly with suppliers. That said, as we've always done, we work very, very closely with communities, often passed on to us by members, to make sure we help them navigate through that scheme and get the best out of that scheme. Can I draw your attention to paragraph 29 to 32, which is really around allowing more delivery and trying to help them. So if I come on to Project Gigabit, so Project Gigabit is a programme launched by government in March 2021. And it really is about government's proposals to spend £5 billion to get 100% gigabit-enabled coverage by 2032. Now, what they're trying to do is get 80% coverage by 2025 as part of that programme. Now, we've engaged with government quite significantly as part of this, with the team here in the County Council, to try and understand what their plans are and to work with them to understand how we can support those. And through that work and through being able to demonstrate some of the challenges we face in Hampshire, Hampshire is actually now part of what they call Phase 1B of the programme, which is fairly early in the delivery part of that programme. And really what we're now trying to understand is what the role is that we can play in supporting that local delivery. And part of that will be the procurement, the local knowledge that we bring, and key for us is really understanding that and how it fits with the voucher scheme. And can I just then draw your attention to the last part of the report, which is paragraphs 33 to 36, which is the finance. So this sets out the gain share mechanism referenced in the report, which is really an underwriting of the risk that the private sector is taking by putting public subsidy in, based upon a model of take-up of the premises. And what we are seeing is the take-up being, in essence, larger than the modelling that was in the contracts, and therefore some of that public money comes back to us and to BD UK as part of what they call the gain share mechanism. And it's this mechanism that we're using to propose to actually top up the scheme, where we're expecting around £1.1 million to come back into the County Council in 2022, which will form part of that top-up funding. And that, Leader, is all I was proposing to say on the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I've just got a very quick question on this gain share. How exactly it works in terms of when you've got to spend it by, because I know the previous one there was some concern about that the cut-off, I think I'm right in saying, was in March, and it would have been nice to see it continue. Are you satisfied that with this new gain share scheme that we will have the opportunity of spending all the money that's allocated back to us?
Yes is the answer to that. What we're seeing is both a really significant interest in the voucher scheme, but also, as Councillor Porter mentioned, we're seeing an increase in prices for the delivery of the infrastructure, and therefore it's costing more to do that. So I think the cut-off of the money itself isn't actually down to the gain share. It's not time-bound in terms of the spend. The time-bound element of the previous scheme was the gigabit voucher scheme itself, which closed in March, but I hope that clarifies that.
Thanks for that, Patrick. Questions? Steve Forster.
Thank you, Leader, and thank you for that report. And it's really encouraging to see the work that the team is doing with government, and therefore prioritising the Scheme 1B that you mentioned that will be in the early adopter phase of that, because that reduces our cost exposure, so to speak. I'm delighted to see this recommendation and this fund available, in particular because this isn't a statutory requirement for the council. Many people think it's the council's responsibility to deliver broadband, and this is a responsibility of Openreach to deliver. We are topping this up to accelerate the delivery, and I think that's a really important point. So we are helping residents, and part of the reason we're doing that and extending this scheme is the change, the new working that we were talking about earlier on, which COVID has accelerated the requirement for home working and therefore for faster broadband, etc. So this is just accelerating that. But I do want to stress that it's not statutory. We're doing it because I guess it's the right thing to do. On the previous scheme, we did agree funding, and government extended that scheme without much advance notice. And we delivered the full funding that we committed on it. There was no reduction in funding, there were no changes, but the scheme was extended. So what we're seeing now is a further top up on that, using the rebate that we've had. And I think that will benefit areas like the New Forest, any areas where we have the small number of properties that aren't reached by high-speed broadband. Overall, what's recommended, I think, will be closely monitored so that we do see value for money, and we do see the outlying properties that were mentioned delivered to, and hopefully delivered to by Openreach on an economically satisfactory basis, because it is important that they don't attempt to profiteer or take advantage of public money that's being spent on supporting something that they have a duty to actually deliver.
Thank you, Steve. Any other comments from around the table? Steve Reid.
Yes, I think Councillor Forster's mentioned something very important, which I've always summarised as that the more we help, the more we make it our fault. But it isn't. We are just helping to get this out. It is ironic, I think, that when all the funds that were allocated in the previous round were used up, the story that was being put out was that Hampshire had pulled the funding on it, and it was far from that. It was the money was being used up, and the money that we put in through that was not part of our statutory responsibility, just something we wanted to do. The other point I'd make is that recommendation 5, where we note that the broadband infrastructure will play a critical role in supporting policies to mitigate and tackle climate change, could be augmented, and we could say that not only is it helping to mitigate and tackle climate change, but will also help the Hampshire economy to recover post-COVID, because it is an integral part of our strategy. I'm not suggesting that we put that in, but it's worth noting that we are doing something here which is absolutely vital to the Hampshire economy.
Thank you, Steve. Russell.
Thank you, Chairman. I've worked with Patrick and Glenn Peacey on several top-up schemes, and I really thank them and commend them for the work they do. They've been extremely helpful in my division. And I'm proud of the role Hampshire County Council has played in getting broadband to some of our rural areas. I just want to ask about the commercial schemes that might be coming to Hampshire. We've seen that Openreach have been expanding their plans following their deal with Ofcom. We know that there's a BD UK open market review that you refer to coming in the autumn. So firstly, is there a risk that our top-up funding might go to an area that would have otherwise got a commercial scheme? And secondly, to avoid that risk, could we prioritise the hardest to reach areas with a sort of outside-in approach so that we mitigate that risk to a certain extent?
Thank you, Councillor Oppenheimer. On your first point on the commercial side, you rightly point out that there's an open market review taking place at the moment as part of government's Project Gigabit. So what we are doing is we'll get sight of that open market review, so we'll get to see where the private sector will be starting to deliver as part of that. And on your point on the risk of likely to build where the commercial sector is going, part of the way government is talking to us about the voucher schemes at the moment is making sure there's clarity of which ones are in the pipeline, which ones are contracted with suppliers, and therefore which ones are there a risk of them building where the private sector is going to go, or actually the procurement of Project Gigabit is going to go. And so there is a mechanism in place, being put in place by government, so they're watching that very point. So there's not overbuild, there's not build where the commercial sector is going, but more importantly, communities are not investing in schemes where they are likely to get caught and included in the Project Gigabit procurement. So there is join up in respect of the procurement there.
Yeah, thank you.
Rob.
Just one quick question, Patrick, in terms of who actually makes the final decision in terms of the scheme, and if it is, and you know, lots of my local communities as well, they don't know where they sit within that, and it's just understanding who makes the decision, and is there a way of finding out at what point are they in that decision-making progress in the list, so to speak?
Thank you, Councillor Humphrey. The decision is made by government, by BD UK. They administer the scheme, the vouchers are issued by the scheme, we provide the top-up to BD UK to administer that. But we do keep in close contact with them to understand where the pipeline is and which schemes have been approved and which ones haven't. And I think part of our role is to make sure we stay close to government to understand what that pipeline is and to make sure we represent the best for the communities in Hampshire.
Anyone else? Okay, well, as far as I can see, these schemes get more and more complicated the further down the road we get. I just hope people on the ground understand the point that was made this morning, that we're on their side, trying to persuade Openreach to do everything they should be doing, and we're only subsidising where we really need to ensure that our residents, who would otherwise not get super fast broadband, get it as soon as possible. And whether or not I should declare an interest, I still think I've got the division with the least coverage in the county. Whether that's true or not, it certainly was a year or two ago. So I should perhaps declare a personal interest in terms of the matters that have been discussed over the last few minutes. On that point, are you all happy to agree the recommendations on page 113, paras 2 to 5? Thank you very much. Let's move on to item 10. And first of all, Jackie, you've got a few things you'd like to say before we discuss this item.
Thank you.
Patrick, thank you very much for your...
I'd like to echo the thanks to the team. I think their work with members is exemplary on the broadband team. This is regarding the nationally significant infrastructure projects and development consent orders, and the principle of the PPA is included within that, the Planning Performance Agreement. First of all, thank you very much to the officers for the very extensive report that's just been sent to result of consultation on the M3 Junction 9 work. And I'm very pleased to see the Cart and Horses Junction mentioned in there. Councillor Humby, thank you very much. I'm sure that we all share the same expectations of that work. The point I was going to make in here is that having looked at the NSIP legislation, which makes it very clear that it ensures participants who are taking part in any consultations can do so fully, and that's part of the legislation. of why we are in a position where we need this policy made out so clearly by the Hampshire County Council. I fully agree with putting it there, but nevertheless, it is very frustrating that it appears that applicants through the DCO process, through the NSIP process, have the choice of whether they make a PPA agreement or not. And my question is, how does this policy that we're setting in place here change what is a decision ultimately by the developer itself, by the developer themselves? That's the first question. My second question is relating to item 29. Southern Water, I am so angry about the £165 million having to be paid out when I think of all the work that we've all done at all levels of government about nitrate neutrality. And the Minerals and Waste Plan, I hope, will include something about management of wastewater, particularly when the public are paying to have that water cleaned and it isn't being collected and cleaned and sent out clean, and it isn't being. So my next question is, will Southern Water be, if it is an NSIP, will it be part of our Minerals and Waste Plan? And how will we incorporate the needs of NSIPs in our Minerals and Waste Plan? And the third thing I wanted to raise was about working together with other host authorities. I really appreciate that work that is being done with host authorities, but could you make sure that the county councillors of those divisions in which those things happen are also aware as a matter of course, please, just as we would with any other roadworks? I have to ask a lot about these, and it shouldn't necessarily be the case. The fifth point I was going to bring about was really the challenge of the process, not at the consultation stage that we're talking about here, and it's actually mentioned in the paper, but the challenge of the intense work that takes place during the whole inspection process. And I know it's raised in this paper here. Having been just a local authority member, as Winchester City Council taking part in the ACWIND process, it was agonising because I was so conscious of the pressure, not just on the officers, but also on myself. When I don't know, Ed was looking at me like this, he was obviously involved in it too. The overnight works, the sudden midnight deadlines, the complete lack of concern by the PINS inspector, basically to be aware of local authority pressure. And I just wanted to raise that I do sympathise with that part of the policy, absolutely. And the fact that we get nothing for it in terms of money is equally galling. But my main point about this is, how does this written paper change what we can do to influence developers who choose not to have a PPA with us? In our case, Highways England in this case.
Thank you, Jackie. Some quite complicated questions. We'll obviously answer the ones we're able to this morning, and if there are ones we can't, we'll certainly get back to you with
I can certainly see Councillor Heron nodding.
I know, I realise that. I'm relying upon him to some extent to contribute towards the answers. But before he does, I'd like to ask Keith Wilcox to actually brief us on this particular item on the agenda.
Thank you, Leader, and good morning, members. I'm here today deputising for Stuart Jarvis. I will do what I can on the paper that Councillor Porter's asked those questions, but I'm more comfortable to an extent on the second paper, but here we go. The purpose of the first paper is it's about this proposal for the County Council to manage its involvement in these nationally significant infrastructure projects and the resulting development consent order process. In terms of context, an NSIP is a large-scale project. It falls into one of the following categories that's outlined in paragraph 8. It's about energy, waste, transport, water, or business and commercial. They're deemed to be of national significance, and the legislation came about really to speed up that process. It was taking too long, with the best example being Terminal 5 at Heathrow, that took a total of 6 years in total. In terms of the process, it involves 6 stages. It's set out at para 14 in diagrammatic form, and is covered in paras 15 to 23. In terms of the NSIP projects in Hampshire, there's been a number within the county. Some have been through the DCO process, others are expected. We've had the SO pipeline, the DCO was granted in 2020. We've had the Aquin that Councillor Porter has referred to, which is the electricity interconnector between Portsmouth to Waterlooville. We've got the M334 Winchester grade separated motorway junction expected early next year. We've got ABP and the possible port expansion down at Dibden. There's no timescales as yet for that one. And then we've got again a possible desalination plant with Southern Water in Testwood. So there is a lot of potential activity. In terms of the key issues for the County Council, firstly, the NSIP numbers are expected to increase in the future as the government is encouraging more use of this process and to speed up the decision-making process. So I think there's clearly a need to put a process in place to ensure members are aware of the proposals and are completely fully briefed. The whole process can be very resource intensive. Again, Councillor Porter has made reference to that, especially at the pre-application stage. This is at the very early start of the process. And there is a need to engage early on in that process from the County Council as a host authority. The proposed approach to managing this involvement is really from para 37 onwards. And I think the first point here is that each NSIP will be very different in size and scale. So it will be necessary to adopt a set of almost guiding principles rather than a specific set of perhaps actions. It's proposed that a new subgroup of the corporate infrastructure group be established to track these emerging projects and to report on the key issues. I think it's also in the paper covers, it's also reasonable for the County Council to seek to cover its costs in the process, working with the applicant on issues through a planning performance agreement, a PPA. And a PPA will, with the applicant, will provide the funding to allow for the sufficient resources to be deployed. A further suggestion is to propose that a pre-application charging policy be developed to cover the early process, and that's up to the point that the application is submitted. That is because quite often there could be a lot of work early on in a pre-application stage. The applicant then doesn't carry on, so therefore there's quite a lot of aborted time and effort and resource that goes into something very early on in the process. The recommendations are then set out, Leader, at the start of this paper. So that is the brief run through the paper. Shall I address Councillor Porter's questions? Okay.
Yes, if you would. Thank you.
Okay. If I may, Councillor Porter, I'll work backwards as how I sort of log them. I think we've talked about the intense workload. That is part of the purpose of this paper, really, to try and log the fact that we have struggled to find the resources on the Aquin. It's been a huge amount of work over that 6-month examination process, and we need to make sure that we are ready in the future. Now, working with some of the applicants in terms of getting these PPAs, we are working quite hard, and I've been in meetings with Highways England to try and say we need to have a PPA. What's in it for Highways England? Well, the issues fundamentally here is that if we can get one, it allows us to have funding to give more resources to address it. That would hopefully allow, going through a discussion and dialogue, that there would be more workload coming in from us, and fundamentally it would allow the applicant, Highways England in this place, to have an easier way through the process. So it is within our interest as the County Council, there's a resource, but it is within the applicant's interest, because it may be not necessarily a different outcome, but a smoother process to get to the outcome. So that's the first point. In terms of the host local authorities working with others, I think that's a short yes. I think the host authorities, of which we are one, should work with others, and I think that is in hand, and we will do that. The next one about Southern Water, NSIP and the Minerals and Waste local plan, I would like, Councillor Porter, if I may, to defer the detail of that in terms of the linkage with minerals and waste. But I think the The overall comment would be, yes, we would wish to work and make sure that the two are dovetailed and would go together. But I'd like to come back, if I may, on that particular point. And the first one, I think I've sort of half covered it. It was about the PPA and the developer and why do we have one and all the rest of it. No? Apologies.
Just really, how does this paper change the decision of developers in the process? What will you be using this to change the decision of developers about PPA? Or are you hoping really just to put this down in writing so that people understand what our position is?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think we're trying to set out a clear policy, a clear way forward for the county council to get a better process. Is this going to change the way the applicant would view things? Possibly not. But I think it gives us the cover and the resources to be able to go and address future PPAs and future DCOs with more resource, and therefore what is in their interest is that it's a very, very good chance that they would have a better outcome.
Thank you very much, Keith, for that very thorough and intricate, dare I say it, explanation about exactly what we're up to. Rob, I know you've got something, and Edward's probably got something to say afterwards.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. First of all, thank you to Keith, having said that it's not really his area. He certainly has a great deal of knowledge on this and answered very well, so well done to you. There's a couple of points. There was just one other, Councillor Porter, in terms of the members being engaged and involved. That's one thing that we can make sure that does happen. But I think this really came from a lot of learning out of the Aquin proposal, where I've spoken to the team in planning as well, and about what happened with that, why did it happen. So we've learnt from that, and I suppose this paper has evolved from that, I think. And we always need to remember that we're not there to sort of support or not support an application. We're there to give technical advice, and that's exactly what we do. But I think it does clearly set out, and Keith has spoken about the capacity issues we have. We've done an enormous amount of work on projects that we've not been able to cover our costs for. So I suppose this sets down a bit of a marker to anybody putting an application in. This is how we are going to work as an authority, and it's better to work with us. But I stress that's not supporting or not supporting that, it's just giving that technical advice. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Rob. Edward.
Chairman, thank you. First, I better declare personal interest. I think people know I work in planning consultancy. I will say I don't work on NSIPs and I don't do any in Hampshire, so, but it's just there for the record. Chairman, I think the first thing I would do, what I was smiling as Councillor Porter was saying, is I think we all recognise the immense amount of work that goes into the NSIP process, whether that's officers responding or members' involvement. And as Councillor Porter said, quite often things that have been long in the formation change quite close to the day that that item is being considered in the inspection process, and that is a challenge for everybody. I just wanted to talk a little about, because I think one of my concerns when this came forward was thinking, well, a planning performance agreement, those who think that they can work with us to get a positive outcome from our area, well, there is obviously an incentive to have a planning performance agreement, because you want to try and tail off as much as possible. But I was thinking in my mind, if I was a proposer of a scheme who felt that we were going to get a negative response from the county council for some reason, whether that's a highways issue or whatever, why would I want to go into a planning performance agreement? Why would I want to engage in that? And I think actually there is still an incentive for them. The first one is that what they require, whether they agree with us or dispute us, is comprehensive information in a timely fashion. Even if they then want to hand that to their experts to say, why do you think they're wrong? And I think there is an incentive in here for all promoters to come through. I welcome the paper. I think it sets out a clear roadmap. I'm sure not everybody will engage positively. It's the same with pre-app advice. I am often astounded at those that pay consultants a fortune to find out what the, for example, Highways Authority think of a project instead of paying the Highways Authority a normally much smaller fee for them to tell them what they think of the project. But, you know, Chairman, I welcome this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. Any other comments? Okay, are you happy with the... Oh, sorry, Steve.
I just had one, and it centres around paragraph 29, and it's really about timescales. Southern Water has recently consulted on its Water for Life strategy, and to make good any shortfalls in times of dry weather and drought. And it hasn't yet decided whether it's going to apply for planning permission through the local planning authority or the NSIP regime. Now, I'm just troubled by the fact that we have loads of developments which are planned for the southern part of the county and a clear need to improve the water supply, but we're still at the thinking about how to do it stage and whether to apply this way or that way. And I'm just concerned that the need is there, but the bureaucracy has not yet been overcome by Southern Water. And I'm just wondering whether we have a problem brewing on the timescale front.
Thank you, Steve. Keith, I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Yes, Leader, thank you. I think, Councillor Reid, the big issue here is, will Southern Water keep to a proposal of 75 million litres, which is normal planning process, or if they go to beyond 80 million litres, that will be past the threshold for an NSIP. So I think there could be some tactical work going on in terms of the scale of the development as to which of the planning processes would be followed.
Yes, but the point which I'm trying to make here is that I'm a great believer in development being accompanied by the correct infrastructure, and it strikes me here that we have an infrastructure shortfall. The development is definitely going ahead, so we're into we'll work it out as we go along mode until a decision is made.
Leader, can I just come back on that? Is that okay? Councillor Reid, this is why, certainly through Transport for South East and working with the team, we have lobbied to run sort of development in parallel with infrastructure. That's exactly the point you made. And we have started to make progress on that. But I think if Keith is going to come back to Councillor Porter on those other issues, that's one thing we could pick up and come back to and give you a bit more detail on, if that's okay.
That would be helpful, thank you.
Okay, are you all happy with the recommendations on page 121, paras 2 to 6? All happy? Okay. You're still in the chair, Keith, for the for item 11, the long-running saga of Junction 10.
Yes, thank you, Leader. This report, members, is an update since the February Cabinet report, and it sets out really the evolving financial and the delivery picture, with a view to seeking Cabinet's approval for Hampshire to become the scheme delivery body. Context, the scheme is approximately £81 million, complex motorway junction and associated highway works. It will unlock 6,000 houses, commercial space, including a potential for circa £500 million inward investment proposal, creating approximately 3,000 jobs. So it is a significant development in southern Hampshire. In summary, over the last 4 months, there has been significant discussions with the developers, the local planning authority, Highways England, government departments, and since April, I think it's fair to say we've had virtually weekly meetings with MHCLG and Homes England and DFT. I can report, Leader, that the position now is much improved from February, and our 3 effectively red lines at the time have been overcome, subject to final confirmation. The first one relates to finance, and paragraphs 24 and 25 and tables 1 and 2 set out and show we have moved from a funding position of 56.3 million in April to a maximum funding envelope now of 97.5 million in June. That's with the housing infrastructure grant increasing, developers' contributions increasing, and a development capped contingency fund coming into play. The second red line was around Highways England's role. Highways England have responsibility for managing the motorway and the trunk road network in this country, and up until recently have resisted having a role in the promotion or delivery of this motorway junction. However, we have now in recent weeks reached agreement with Highways England and the DFT that they will sign an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. In essence, this will provide a safety net for the County Council on any cost increases if due to Highways England or the DFT, and they will bear that cost. The final red line was about the contractual arrangements and splitting of the grant, the HIG grant. They've now agreed to split it, one part covering the motorway junction, which we would sign as the Highway Authority, and the other part for Fareham Borough Council to sign as the local planning authority, covering the development and the affordable housing. So overcoming these hurdles has significantly changed the position from where we were in February. There are still risks with a project of this nature. There could be cost overrun, there could be some construction risks, but we believe we now have sufficient funding and mechanisms in place to be able to successfully deliver it, and government departments are very keen that we do so. Chairman, and then the recommendations follow as set out in the paper, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Keith. I don't think I want to go into all the detail as to how we got to where we are now, but this is really very encouraging. Am I right in saying this is probably the largest construction project of its type to be carried out by a county council in England?
It's certainly, Leader, it's certainly the largest for Hampshire County Council. I think that there may be one or two possibly larger in other counties, but it is certainly in the top few percentage quartile of significant projects that we are undertaking effectively on somebody else's network.
I only make that point because I think it is important to understand that we can only do that because of our size and capacity, whereas many other authorities would not have the capability of doing it because they just would not have the capacity, the experience or the knowledge. Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and thank Keith for that report. And I note, Lady, didn't want to go into the detail, but I think it is worth mentioning just the amount of time and effort that has gone into this. And I must mention Stuart Jarvis, and indeed, along with Keith Wilcox as well, and others within the team that have put in to continually being supporting this scheme, but also standing our ground from the county's point of view. And indeed, Leader, the work that you have done there, making those points in terms of almost those contributions having nearly doubled from the start of this negotiations, and including the Chief Executive and Carolyn as well. An enormous amount of time has gone into this, and I think it is worth just noting, because there was considerable pressures and very often discussions going around that we weren't supporting it. Well, actually, quite the opposite. There's an enormous amount of support that's gone into this, so please take that back. I know Stuart can't be with us today to make sure that that is noted. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. I totally support your comments. What I think it demonstrates is that we are robust enough not to agree things when pressure is put on us, of the sort that has been put on us over the last few years. But we're reasonable enough to understand that if our legitimate concerns are agreed and dealt with, then we are prepared to take on a project of this type. And that, to me, is a very important point as to how the County Council stands in relation to its relations with departments in Whitehall. There was just one final point. Do we actually know how far the planning permission has progressed at Fareham? Because I know that's one of the... because the planning permission, as I understand it, has to change because of the various factors associated with the affordable housing and other matters.
Leader, I would say that the work is continuing at pace. The Section 106 is not signed at the moment, but I understand that it would be fairly imminent, hopefully within the next month or so.
Thank you very much for that. So we can say that we've done all we we can at this stage to see the project move forward, and now it's up to others to ensure that they do their bit to ensure that we can get the thing off the ground, if that's the best way of describing a junction. Anyone else got anything else to say? Steve?
I'd like to examine in greater depth, if I could, the risk mitigation. I think it is a huge compliment to Hampshire County Council that we're considered able to do this work, but we have to be considered able to do this work because we ask and answer the awkward questions. There's an old phrase in project management that if you think you have mitigated every risk, you've missed something. So what I want to talk about is the generality of the third-party decisions that could be made that could impact this problem and therefore could potentially impact Hampshire's finances if we haven't covered them off. Now, Keith said that Highways England and the DFT have agreed that if they make decisions that increase the cost of this project, Hampshire County Council will be absolved. The question is, has everybody signed up to the fact that if they make decisions, Hampshire will be absolved, or do we still run the risk of potentially huge impacts on Hampshire's finances because there are things that could happen that represent a risk that could still impact on us? So I think we just need to be sure as a cabinet that that question can be answered.
John, do you want to comment on that?
I'm neither a lawyer nor an accountant, so I'm treading into difficult ground here. But what I would say to Councillor Reid's completely reasonable question is that it was the question which has dictated our negotiations over the last few years, and particularly the last 6 months. I'd strongly echo the point that the leader made just now, that we've tried to approach this matter willingly with a view to the importance to the economy and the wider development of the county, in partnership with other local authorities and with government, but not in such a way that we would expose the county council to current or future unacceptable risks. And I can, for example, confirm that throughout the negotiations, the Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Corporate Resources, soon to be the new Chief Executive, was absolutely relentless in stressing that what we did not want to do was to reach an agreement which seemed positive now but left a legacy of debt to our successors, either as officers or members. Now, the advice I've had from lawyers and accountants throughout this process, as well as from the technicians in ETE, is that we are as secure as we can be, and that would include that the liabilities for the project going wrong, if anybody else tries to, frankly, misbehave in the way that you're alluding to, that risk would fall on others, not the county council. We're clear about that. But it has. I just want to assure you, it's been a question that's dictated our negotiations throughout. I don't know if Carolyn wants to add to that.
Thank you, John. Just to state the obvious, we can never completely mitigate the risks in anything that we do as a county council. As John said, what we've aimed to do is to get as close as possible to a full underwrite from government, in that we've got the Highways England and Department for Transport commitment. We've significantly increased the funding streams from all parties. And the fallback, frankly, is the 4.5 million LTP funding for as long as it would take if that were to be called into play. And that was quite a critical factor, because if we didn't have that annual funding coming from government that we could direct towards this in the event that it was necessary, then we would be underwriting it from our reserves or from our recurring budget, and it wouldn't be appropriate that that risk would fall on the residents of Hampshire. So I think it's fair to say we've done absolutely everything that we can to mitigate that risk, but we can never be complete in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you, Leader. I just wanted to get that on the record, as it were, that we believe that we have done everything to mitigate the risks of it falling onto Hampshire.
Thanks, Steve. Right, you all happy with the recommendations at Para 2, sub-paras 2.1 to 2.7? All happy? Let us move on. Thank you very much, Keith, for your efforts. Moving on to item 12, Serving Hampshire. And I think Antonia Perkins is standing in for Deborah, if I'm right.
That's right. Thank you, Leader. The report before you is the regular annual corporate performance report, which you normally receive at this time of year. And additionally, the report also contains, as usual, the overview of Ombudsman determinations for the year. So as you'll see, overall performance in 2021 has been judged as good, which Cabinet may wish to note is remarkable given the intense strain and challenges that services have faced this past year from the pandemic, also coupled with the ongoing pressures on the budget, which are very significant. As you'll be aware from previous corporate performance reports that you've seen, the judgment on performance is based on department's risk-based commentary against the current set of performance measures, and this is also alongside an overview of key achievements, external validation and resident feedback via an online residents forum. The full list of sources of external validation is included at Appendix 1. In previous years, we've had more of an emphasis on these external sources, so there's a number of layers of assurance which are provided to you, which make up the entire performance report. Paragraph 14 of the paper highlights that the majority of performance measures for the year were reported as either low or medium risk, with only 3 being identified as high risk. These 3 are set out in paragraph 17, and you'll see that the high-risk measures all relate to the impact of COVID on performance. CCBS income levels and school meal take-up was previously flagged in the 6-monthly corporate performance report. With regard to these 2 measures, performance has very much improved in the latter half of the year. This is linked to lockdown measures being lifted and a return to classroom-based teaching. Some difficulties remain for the percentage of waste diverted from landfill by HWRCs for the reasons set out in the report. However, this situation is being closely monitored and managed and is anticipated to improve as we move further into recovery from the pandemic. The next section sets out a number of key performance highlights from the year. These are more fully set out in Appendix 2. I don't intend to go through all of those, but you'll see there's a number of significant performance highlights to look back on from the past year. The twice-yearly performance reports to Cabinet also set out an equality update. Section 22 provides a number of highlights to be noted, including the development of an innovative programme of engagement with target communities from ethnic minority groups to ensure key COVID-19 public health messages were delivered effectively. The publication of the County Council's Modern Slavery Statement, requiring all key services to assess and log status against the statement. The introduction of a new departmental self-assessment of the inclusivity and accessibility of all services. And lastly to note, there's a launch of an inclusion and wellbeing survey for our staff to track the views and experiences of employees and progress made internally regarding inclusion issues since the previous survey in 2018. So in summary, the level of performance of the past year has remained good, and this is very much in the face of unprecedented challenges that the County Council has faced, and in no small part thanks to the commitment and flexibility of staff. In terms of recommendations for the performance side of the report itself, you'll see that as well as noting performance, it is recommended that Cabinet acknowledge staff for their contribution to keeping performance at this good level over the past year. Barbara Beardwell is also here to answer any questions that Cabinet might have on the Ombudsman section. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Antonia. Questions from my colleagues? Anyone got anything at all? Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Leader. I think Antonia's presented the report extremely well. It was looked at by the Policy and Resources Select Committee, and I think on the performance side of things, there was noting rather than adverse comment, and it was a very positive thing. The Select Committee, I think, focused more on the Ombudsman side of things than on the overall performance, which was very heartening. It's worth just noting that we used to have a system where we self-assessed, and we decided that we'd move away from that because people are very likely to sort of take the Mandy Rice-Davies attitude, well, they would say that, wouldn't they, if the result came out well. So we're using as many external assessments as possible, and almost to a man they are positive. So that is very good. With regard to the Ombudsman side of things, I think our attitude is that we accept the referee's decision and we move on from there.
Thank you, Steve. Ros.
Thank you, Leader. Just in regards to Councillor Reid's comments about the Ombudsman and in relation to that, the Select Committee that pre-scrutinised this paper have received a full briefing in regards to any questions that they had on the day of their meeting to do with the Children's Services Department.
Yes, I think the only point I'd add to that is that the Ombudsman's report could have also reflected on the fact that this burden was placed upon us by central government with no funding to put it right. But we're doing our very best within our limited resources to do so. Are you all happy with the recommendation? Steve?
Thank you, Leader. Just very briefly, I just wanted to draw people's attention, particularly members of the public who may be interested, in paragraph 18, the performance highlights, which is quite an extensive list. And I think it may raise some eyebrows in terms of just what we have achieved. It's quite remarkable. I just wanted to highlight that.
Yes, I think you make a very good point, bearing in mind that we've gone through a pandemic and then we still have to as much as we can, meet our targets for normal conditions. And we've managed to do that, I think, pretty well. Are you all, or do you all agree the recommendations at para to little a or a brackets to e brackets? Agreed. Thank you very much. Item 13, Serving Hampshire Strategic Plan 21-25, the Corporate Performance Management Framework. Antonia, you remain in the chair to answer those particular points.
Yes, thank you, Leader. So this second report sets out the proposed new strategic plan for 2021 to 25, as well as some proposed amendments to the Corporate Performance Framework, which will sit alongside it. As a Cabinet will be aware, the strategic plan is revised every 4 years to coincide with the new administration, and it provides the overarching framework for the County Council, which will guide all decision making. You'll see in paragraph 9, we've set out the activities which are undertaken in developing the new draft. As requested specifically by the Leader, the recommendations from the Hampshire 2050 Commission of Inquiry feature very heavily in the new plan, and this is partly due to the significant body of evidence and consultation with key partners, stakeholders and the community, which helped develop the Commission's recommendations. The new plan retains the existing 4 outcomes in the current plan as per paragraph 12. However, underneath these sit the County Council's area for focus within the next 4 years, and these have been revised, taking into account the current policy landscape and the context in which the Council is operating in, including, obviously, recovery from the pandemic. Moving forward, the next section provides some commentary on the new priority areas. The full strategic plan is set out at Appendix 1, and you'll see here very much that the focus on the Hampshire 2050 recommendations have been woven in throughout the plan. And there's a continuing emphasis on focusing the Council's resources where they're needed most and exploiting technology to innovate where possible to provide a more efficient but still effective service. The Council's focus on climate change as well is amplified within Outcome 3 with the new plan. And lastly, the key role of the voluntary sector, our partners in the VCS, is recognised in Outcome 4, and the relationship with the sector is emphasised as being a key part of the county's recovery from the pandemic. Also included in the new plan are the principles which set out the way we work as a council, and these describe how we will deliver the plan as opposed to the outcomes setting out the what we will deliver. Just moving on from the plan itself, supporting this is the Corporate Performance Framework. And this report sets out the proposed changes to that. So building on the existing reporting regime, of which the previous report is part of, which includes risk-based department assessments, external validation, as Councillor Reid mentioned, and key performance indicators. The new framework proposes a much stronger link with the climate change and Hampshire 2050 reporting, as well as the inclusion of a new director's performance assessment, which adds an additional layer of assurance. These elements and their reporting intervals are set out in the report in Figure 1 and 2. In terms of the report's recommendations, Cabinet are asked to approve the performance management framework and to recommend to full council the approval of the new strategic plan. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for Antona for presenting the report. It's only a comment, really. It's like all good plans. They're able to adapt and flex depending on circumstances, and we'd like to see that we're able to do that with this. And Leader, you mentioned the inclusion of the 2050 Commission, and I'm wondering whether there's opportunity to sort of think about Hampshire the Place and the Hampshire story to be included in that as well. And that is about our joined up partnership working that we do, but it'd just be nice to see that reflected in there as well.
I entirely agree with that. I'm certain we can do that without any problem. I'd just like to comment on the fact that the 2050 recommendations have been included in our plan. It's so often the case that reports are published by counties and indeed governments, and their shelf life is almost over by the time it gets to the press. In other words, it's done and then we move on. What I think is very notable about the way we do things is when we go to the trouble of carrying out what was a fairly extensive analysis of long-term trends in the way we look after residents in our county, we've now not simply said, thank you very much, that was an excellent report, and then move on. We've actually incorporated that report within our performance criteria. We've also looked at it and revised it, and as recently as last week we had a meeting where we had the commissioners attending to see exactly how things have changed since the report was published and how the things have remained the same, and to actually acknowledge the fact that this was an outstanding report that looked at the future of our county in the long term, and now we're actually following through on those recommendations and relating them to the report. So I think that was a really good exercise, and I'm delighted that the findings of the Commission are included in these recommendations. And are there any other comments at all? So you're happy with the recommendation at Para 2 for us and the recommendation at Para 3 on page 195 to recommend to the County Council the approval of Serving Hampshire Strategic Plan 2021 to 2025. All in agreement? And finally, item 14, constitutional matters. Well, having started the ball rolling at the beginning of our agenda, I note that the outgoing Chief Executive, on probably his last performance, unless we have another meeting of this sort before the end of this, during the next week, will address with the monitoring officer the constitutional matters at item 14.
Thank you very much, Leader, and I'm going to let you down, I'm afraid, because I'm going to deftly hand over straight to the monitoring officer.
Very wise.
Because as I said earlier, I'm definitely not a lawyer, so over to Barbara, please.
Thank you, Leader. The report simply sets out and asks Cabinet to note the executive portfolios and responsibilities consequential upon appointment of the new Cabinet. The report also asks Cabinet to agree a couple of changes as set out in the report. Firstly, to the composition of the Local Outbreak Engagement Board and the Cabinet Subcommittee on Economic Growth and Recovery, again consequential upon the revised allocation of executive functions. So far as the executive portfolios go, the changes are now included in the Constitution, and it's simply a matter for Cabinet to note the new portfolios, and they'll be reported to a full council again next week.
Thank you, Barbara. Any comments from my colleagues? Okay. Happy with the recommendations on page 213, paras 3 to 5? Thank you, and that completes the Cabinet meeting. Thank you all very much. Just about on time.